Hello, Old Donation family and friends. This is Bob Randall, and we're going to talk about the Gospel according to Mark, week 3, which begins in chapter 7. But before we begin in 7, I want to remind you of something Jesus said back in chapter 4, verse 9. Let anyone with ears to hear listen, because it will become a critical theme of what Jesus is trying to do in this next section. In Mark 7, we begin with a series of conflicts that continue what we've seen the last few chapters, where it seems that Jesus does miracles and even his own disciples, as well as all others, misunderstand. And the key question over and over again has been, who is this guy? In chapter 7 at the beginning, he has these conflicts over whether or not he and his followers are actually obeying the law of God. And the Pharisees and scribes say, you're not doing what we're supposed to do. Jesus says, this is the same argument the prophets had. They always asked, well, you're pretty good at worship, but does your life reflect God's desire for our lives? What is true worship? And Jesus almost is saying, you're pretty good at defining exactly every detail of what the law might mean, but you've lost what the heart of the law is. You're not so good at actually doing what God wants us to do. And so it's almost like a Reformation 1,500 years before Martin Luther has much the same kind of argument. As the gospel progresses, we see Jesus move into the area of Tyre. As I said last week, geography is important, and Tyre tells us that he has crossed over the boundary again into Gentile territory. And he meets a woman, a Syrophoenician woman, who comes and asks for healing for her daughter. And Jesus responds to her in a way that we don't think sounds like Jesus. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Did Jesus really say that? But the woman is quicker than Jesus. She answers him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he says back to her, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And so she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. It's an interesting story, one that we can have a little fun with as long as we're willing to accept that maybe Jesus got caught off guard. Maybe the woman is actually teaching Jesus that she's the one who knows and understands what his ministry and mission should be, if he's in fact from God, who is the God and creator of all people. So it's an interesting story. We're going to have a little fun with it when we talk. So after the experience with the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus goes into the region of the Decapolis. Remember the 10 cities, which were Roman, Greco-Roman cities, not Jewish by nature. And someone comes up and asks for healing who is a deaf person. And Jesus heals this person and prays and says, be opened. And then we have him go on, and he goes back into the Jewish territory, and he teaches all day, and now there are 4,000 people that need to be fed. And remember last week we fed 5,000 people. Now Jesus is going to feed 4,000. But what happens? Jesus says, well, feed them. And the disciples say, well, how can we feed all these people out here while we are in the desert? Again, remember, Mark is trying to help us understand they're not in the desert. They're in the Galilee, which is the breadbasket of all Israel. And it's a place of plenty. But the disciples don't seem to get the point. This is what Jesus has already done. He's already shown them that with very little, he can do that spiritual feeding of all these people, and they will leave satisfied, and they do it again. Then the gospel goes on, and the Pharisees come asking Jesus, well, will you give us a sign? And Jesus says, a sign? What more signs do you need? I've just healed people who were possessed by demons. I have fed the hungry. I have healed people of leprosy, of skin diseases. I've healed people who were blind and people who could not hear. There will be no more signs for you at all. I'm done producing signs. It says after the Pharisees asked for this sign that Jesus refuses to give them, the disciples get back into the boat to go to the other side again. But when they get in the boat, they start recognizing that they forgot to bring any more bread, and they only have one loaf. And so they start talking about why did they forget the bread when Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, the yeast of Herod. And they say, is he saying that because we forgot the bread? And Jesus says, what are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? Jesus, you can hear his frustration. We just fed 5,000 people, 4,000 people with very little bread. Now you're worried because there are 13 of us and we only have 1 loaf. And he's making the point, the yeast of the Pharisees, the yeast of Herod, is that of unbelief, of skepticism. And he's saying, come on, do you not have ears to hear? If you do, listen. And then he comes into Bethsaida. And this is one of the more important of all the healings that we've heard. They come into Bethsaida, and some people bring a blind man to Jesus and ask him to touch him, to heal him. But he takes the blind man out to the outside of town, and he lays hand on his eyes, and he asks the blind man, can you see anything? And the blind man looks up and says, I see people, but it looks like trees walking. And Jesus takes his hands to his eyes a second time, and he looked intently, and the man's sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now, there are a couple things to notice in here. What's with a healing that Jesus can't do in the first time? No other time in all these healings did he have to go back and try it again. But this time, the blind man of Bethsaida only receives partial healing the first time that Jesus says the prayer. And it's when he goes back a second time that it happens. And I want to say this is not part of Mark saying, well, Jesus had to learn how to do healing of blindness, and he had to practice it. Rather, it's key to understanding the very next passage, which is the culmination of the first half of Mark. And so at the end of that healing, Jesus goes with his disciples into the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asks his disciples, who do the people say I am? And they answer, oh, some say you're John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But then he turns it to them and he says, who do you say that I am? And this is the key question. As I said at the beginning of today's lesson, the question all along is, who is this guy? Now Jesus puts it to the disciples, who do you say I am? You've been following me. You're the ones closest. You've seen all these things, healing of deafness, healing of blindness. And the question of the gospel is answered by Peter. You are the Messiah, the anointed one from God. And then Jesus starts immediately to teach them what is in store for the Messiah, the anointed one. And he talks about suffering. And he talks about how eventually that suffering will lead to crosses. And Peter stops him and rebukes Jesus. And then Jesus rebukes Peter. Remember, this goes back to when Jesus healed Peter's mother, and he came looking for him the next morning and said, "Come on back, I've got something for you to do." Now, Peter is once again playing the stage manager or the campaign manager and says, "Jesus, you can't go talking like that. People aren't going to follow you if you talk about the Messiah is the one who will suffer and die. Instead, you're the one who's supposed to go on the throne." And Jesus says, "You don't get it. This is what I want you to know about the Messiah." And immediately we see once more the blind man of Bethsaida. I see trees walking. He's been showing the disciples all of what he is, but they have a partial vision for what the Messiah, the anointed, is supposed to be. I see trees walking, and it requires a second healing when we finally get to the point where we see who Jesus really is, and therefore what it means for us to follow. And that leads us up onto the Mount of Transfiguration, where we have this magical, mystical moment where Jesus appears in dazzling white clothes. Dazzling white is specified because it's impossible for clothes to become that white again in a desert land without modern detergents and washing machines. Moses and Elijah meet, and why those two? We're going to talk about that. And why on the mountain? Why is it on a mountain with Moses and Elijah that Jesus meets? What is the allusion there? Peter seems to always have foot and mouth disease, and he again misinterprets the mission and says, "Let's build 3 booths right here. Essentially, let's make this a retreat place where everybody can come here and worship." But the voice from the cloud says, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And we know, again, we heard that before. We heard that at the beginning of the gospel, at the very beginning. And down the mountain they go. This is Mark's turning point. Everything has been leading up to the Transfiguration. And now beginning with chapter 9, verse 2, we see the second half starts with this account of a meeting of Jesus on the mountain, hearing from God, and then heading to Jerusalem. So next week, we're going to pick it up and we're going to walk through the rest of chapter 9 and through the middle of chapter 11 on the way to Jerusalem. On Thursday, we'll have 2 Zoom sessions to talk about this, one at 11 in the morning and one at 7 at night. Come join us and we'll talk some more.